My husband set down his fork, looked directly at me across the dinner table we'd shared for 31 years, and said, "Vivian, let's be honest. Without me, you wouldn't last a month." Our son, Connor, stared into his wine glass. His wife, Condo Stephanie, suddenly found something fascinating on her phone. And I sat there in my own kitchen, in the house I had kept alive for 3 decades, and realized I had become a stranger in my own life. Lawrence reached for the bread basket without looking at me again. The conversation moved on. I smiled and started clearing plates. That was the night something inside me stopped apologizing for existing. People always imagine marriages end in screaming, in slammed doors, in dramatic confrontations at midnight. Mine ended quietly, like snow accumulating on a roof. You don't notice the weight until something gives way. When I met Lawrence Holt in the summer of 1989, I was 28 years old and working as a bookkeeper for a small architectural firm in downtown Ottawa. I loved numbers the way some people love music. Intuitively, almost physically. I was good at what I did. My manager, a sharp woman named Roberta Finch, used to say I had the kind of mind that found order in chaos. I didn't realize until much later how rare she thought that was. Lawrence came into the firm to discuss a renovation project. He was confident in the way that men who've never been told no often are. Broad-shouldered, well-dressed, always prepared with exactly the right answer. He asked me to dinner twice before I said yes. We married 18 months later. For a while, it was good. Lawrence was building his commercial real estate business and I was proud of him. We moved to Canada, into a house with a backyard big enough for a garden. Connor was born 3 years after the wedding, and Lawrence suggested, gently, reasonably, that it made more sense for me to stay home. "Just until Connor starts school," he said. "It'll be easier on everyone." I believed him, and I stayed home long after Connor started school, long after Connor graduated university, long after Connor married Stephanie and moved 40 minutes away. I stayed because staying had become the shape of my life, and I no longer knew how to fill a different shape. Lawrence's business grew. We moved into a larger house in the west end of Ottawa, the kind with granite countertops and a double garage that impressed people at church. Lawrence drove a new Lexus every 3 years. He donated to charities and sat on the board of a local business association. People called him a pillar of the community. At dinner parties, women my age would squeeze my arm and say, "You're so lucky, Vivian." Lucky, as though a nice neighborhood erased everything else. The first time Lawrence said something that truly frightened me, I was 54 years old. I had mentioned, carefully, that I might like to take an accounting refresher course at Algonquin College, maybe ease back into part-time work. The look on his face wasn't angry. That would have been easier to name. He smiled. "Vivian, after this long, the field has completely changed. You'd embarrass yourself." He said it the way someone explains a basic fact to a child. Then he went back to his newspaper. I didn't sign up for the course. I told myself he was probably right. That's what 30 years of small moments does to you. Not one catastrophic event. Just 1,000 tiny concessions, each one so reasonable on its own, until one day you look in the mirror and don't recognize the woman looking back. By the time I turned 62, I had developed habits I didn't know I had. I apologized before expressing opinions. I asked permission to buy things for myself. I waited to see what mood Lawrence was in before I spoke at dinner. These weren't dramatic abuses. Nothing that would make a police report. Just a marriage slowly arranged around one person's comfort at the expense of the other's existence. The dinner where Lawrence made his comment about me not lasting a month was a Sunday in late November. Connor and Stephanie had come over. I had spent the afternoon making tourtière from scratch. My grandmother's recipe, the one I'd been making since I was a teenager in Sudbury, along with roasted root vegetables and a cranberry tart that had taken me the better part of the morning. Lawrence had talked for most of the meal about an investment property deal he was finalizing. Then Connor mentioned that a colleague's wife had recently started her own bookkeeping practice at 60. Lawrence shook his head. "Good luck to her," he said. Then he looked at me. "Vivian, let's be honest. Without me, you wouldn't last a month." Connor shifted in his chair. Stephanie checked her phone. The kitchen clock ticked. I smiled. I don't know why. Force of habit, maybe. The smile of a woman who has learned that reacting creates more problems than it solves. But something changed in me that night. quietly and completely. A week later, I found the folder. I wasn't looking for it. I was searching for our home insurance documents, which Lawrence always kept in the filing cabinet in his office. The cabinet was unlocked. I found the insurance documents easily enough. Then, tucked behind a hanging file labeled miscellaneous, I found a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside were bank statements, an account I had never seen before. Scotiabank, registered in Lawrence's name only. The balance was just over $240,000. My hands went cold. We had shared accounts. Or so I believed. Lawrence handled our finances almost entirely. He always said I didn't need to worry about that he had everything managed. I had a personal debit card for groceries and household expenses. The larger financial picture I had trusted completely to him. I stood in his office for a long time, staring at the paper. Then I put everything back exactly as I found it. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while I stared out the window at the bare November garden. That night, lying beside Lawrence in the dark while he slept, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet, definitive one. I needed to find out what else I didn't know. Over the following 2 weeks, I moved through the house like a woman in a dream. I cooked meals. I attended a neighborhood association meeting with Lawrence. I smiled at the right moments during a dinner with his business partner and that man's wife. And all the while, behind my eyes, something cold and clear was building. I photographed the bank statements on my phone. I went through old tax returns stored in the basement. I found records of a numbered company Lawrence had registered 6 years earlier, something he had never mentioned to me. I found statements showing transfers between accounts. Some of the amounts were significant. One evening, Lawrence came into the kitchen while I was making soup and stood behind me. "You seem distracted lately," he said. "I'm tired," I told him. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly. "You should sleep more. You always overthink things." I stirred the soup and said nothing. The following Tuesday morning, after Lawrence left for a client meeting, I drove to a low brick building near the Rideau Center and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going in. The nameplate, beside the entrance door, read, "Eleanor Marsh, Family Law." The receptionist was kind and offered me tea. I sat in the waiting area and filled out a form. Writing Vivian Holt, homemaker. No independent income felt like pressing on a bruise. Eleanor Marsh was in her early 60s, with silver hair cut close and reading glasses that she took on and off as she talked. She looked like someone who had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. When she finally called me in and I sat across from her desk, I nearly cried before I managed a single sentence. "My husband has a bank account I was never told about," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Eleanor didn't react with alarm. She simply asked me to tell her what I knew. The more I explained, the more my embarrassment grew. Did I know all our assets? Not fully. Did I know the nature of the numbered company? No. Was my name on all our property? I thought so, but I wasn't entirely certain. Lawrence handled the paperwork. I signed when he asked me to sign. Eleanor set down her pen. "Vivian." Her voice was careful and even. "I want you to understand something. Being a homemaker for 31 years does not make you legally or financially powerless. Courts recognize contribution to a marriage that goes beyond a paycheck." I looked at her steadily, because those were the first words anyone had said to me in years that felt like solid ground. She gave me a list before I left: tax returns, corporate registrations, property records, RRSP and pension documents. She told me not to confront Lawrence yet. "People who feel exposed often become unpredictable," she said. Driving home through the gray December streets, I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like a woman with a plan. The weeks that followed were the loneliest and most clarifying of my life. I gathered documents carefully, photographing everything before replacing it. What I found confirmed that the hidden account wasn't the whole story. There were transfers out of our joint accounts over several years. Amounts moved gradually, always below the threshold, that might draw attention. Lawrence had been building a financial structure that would protect him if the marriage ended, while I remained entirely unaware that any of this was happening. One night at dinner, Lawrence looked up from his plate. "You're very quiet lately. I have a lot on my mind," I said. He laughed lightly. "About what? You don't have anything to worry about." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, You know divorce would be financially ruinous for you. There it was, not concern, a reminder. I looked at him across the table, really looked at him, and felt something leave me entirely. Not love, that had been leaving quietly for years. Something else. Fear. The particular fear that had kept me small and manageable and grateful for 31 years. You seem very confident about that, I said. He blinked, surprised. Then he smiled like I had said something slightly foolish and went back to eating. That night, I found the document that changed everything. I was going through a box of old paperwork in the basement when I came across a property transfer agreement from 4 years earlier. Lawrence and I had jointly inherited a small parcel of land in eastern Ontario from his aunt when she passed. I remembered signing something connected to it years before. Apparently, the land had been sold, without my knowledge. The proceeds, nearly $90,000, had gone directly into the private account. I sat on the cold basement floor for a long time holding the paper. This wasn't just financial secrecy, this was something else entirely. The following Saturday, Connor came over alone. Stephanie was visiting her sister in Toronto. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee and he asked, quietly, how things were going. It was a careful question. The kind people ask when they already sense the answer. I told him some of it. Not everything. Enough. Connor was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Mom, how long has this been happening? Longer than I realized, I said. He rubbed both hands over his face. He looked in that moment very young and very tired at once. I always thought. He stopped. You thought it was normal, I said gently. Because it was all you knew. He didn't deny it. I drove to Eleanor's office the following week with the property transfer document in my bag. She read it carefully. Then she asked her assistant to step out and looked at me directly. Vivian, I need to ask you something. She paused. Are you certain you signed this? I thought of all the times Lawrence had put papers in front of me. Sign here, Vivian. This is just administrative. Just routine. I hadn't always read carefully. I had trusted him. I don't believe that's my signature, I said. Eleanor's expression shifted slightly. I'm going to have this reviewed. A week later, she called to tell me that a document examiner had flagged 2 property-related signatures as inconsistent with verified samples of my handwriting. She used the words fraudulent and felony level in the same sentence. The room felt like it tilted. I drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could go inside. That evening, by complete coincidence, my old friend Helen Brewster called. We had met at an evening art class years ago and slowly drifted apart. Those things happen when one person's life is organized entirely around someone else's schedule. Helen still lived in Centertown and ran a small pottery studio out of her garage. She'd been asking me to visit for months. I said yes before she finished the invitation. Helen answered the door in an apron dusted with clay and hugged me so hard, I felt something loosen in my chest. Her studio smelled like earth and glaze and warm kiln air. We sat on mismatched stools at her work table, and she made chamomile tea while I tried to figure out where to start. She let me talk for almost an hour without interrupting once. When I finally stopped, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I remember when you used to talk about numbers the way musicians talk about songs. Like you actually loved it. That was a very long time ago, I said, Vivian. She looked at me steadily. It was you, not a phase. I looked away because I didn't trust myself to speak. Helen stood up abruptly and walked to a corkboard covered in papers near the wall. She pulled something down and came back. My studio accounting is an absolute disaster, she said flatly. I have 3 years of receipts in a shoebox and no idea whether I've been profitable. I've been putting off finding someone because I can't afford an actual firm. I stared at her. Look at this! She dropped a stack of crumpled receipts on the table in front of me. Tell me I'm wrong. Slowly, I reached forward and picked up the top receipt. Then the next one. Helen watched me organize them automatically, sorting by category without even thinking about it. After a few minutes, she smiled. There she is, she said quietly. I didn't answer, but I didn't stop sorting either. I left the marriage on a Thursday in February, during a routine week in which nothing dramatic happened. Lawrence was at a business dinner. I had packed 2 bags over the previous month, 1 piece at a time, stored in the back of my car. I left a note on the kitchen table. Not angry, not explanatory, just clear. By the time Lawrence came home, I was already across the city in a 2-bedroom apartment I had rented under my own name with money from the account. Eleanor had helped me establish. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building on Merivale Road, above a dry cleaner. The hallway smelled faintly of steam and detergent. The carpets were older than I would have preferred. But when I set my bags down in the small, bare living room on that February night and locked the door from the inside, the silence felt different than any silence I had experienced in 31 years. It felt like mine. The first days were harder than I expected and easier than Lawrence would have predicted. I cried twice in the first week, properly cried, sitting on the bathroom floor while the radiator clanged beside me. I cried for the version of myself that had believed staying small was the same thing as keeping peace. I cried because I was 62 years old and terrified that I had waited too long. But I kept going to Helen's studio. I organized her 3 years of receipts into a proper bookkeeping system over 4 weekends. When I handed her the finished spreadsheets, her eyes went wide. "Vivian, you did all of this yourself?" "It's basic," I said. "It is absolutely not basic." She stared at the screen. "I've been overpaying my supplier for 2 years. I had no idea." She looked up at me. "You need to be doing this professionally." I laughed in the way people laugh when something frightens them. "Helen, I haven't worked in over 30 years. "And yet," she said, turning the laptop toward me, "you just saved me nearly $4,000 in the time it took to drink 3 cups of tea." That number stayed with me on the drive home, not because of the money, because of the recognition that the part of my brain I had quietly closed off for 3 decades was still there. Still sharp, still mine. Helen referred me to a friend of hers, a woman named Patricia Ossie, who ran a small independent bookshop in the Glebe, and had been managing her own accounts catastrophically. In Patricia's own cheerful words, since opening 6 years earlier. I met Patricia on a rainy March afternoon. She was energetic and direct and had absolutely no patience for her own financial disorder. Within 20 minutes, she had hired me on a part-time basis. The hourly rate she proposed made me go quiet. "Is that too low?" she said immediately. "No," I said. It's been a while since anyone paid me for anything." Patricia looked at me with the practical sympathy of a woman who understood exactly what I meant. "Well," she said, "welcome back." I worked 3 mornings a week at Patricia's shop. The combination of the bookshop itself, the smell of paper, the quietness of the stacks, the customers who came in already knowing what they loved, and the clean simplicity of making numbers tell the truth felt like returning to a language I had spoken before I was told to stop. Lawrence found out through Connor. He called me on a Tuesday evening, and I stood in my small kitchen watching the call display blink his name for 4 rings before I answered. "Connor tells me you're working," he said. "I am," I said. A pause. "Vivian, you don't need to do this." "I know," I said. "I want to." Another pause, longer this time. "This is embarrassing for both of us." I had prepared myself for anger. I hadn't prepared for the genuine confusion in his voice, the bewilderment of a man who had organized his entire life around one woman's dependency and couldn't understand why the structure had stopped working. "I'm managing just fine, Lawrence," I said. "You're not thinking clearly," he said. "This is Eleanor Marsh talking, not you." I closed my eyes briefly. For 30 years, any independent thought I had was evidence that someone had put it there. "Good night, Lawrence," I said, and ended the call. My hands weren't shaking when I put the phone down. That surprised me. It was Helen who told me about the Ottawa Women's Business Network Spring Fair, a weekend market at Aberdeen Pavilion in the Glebe, where local women-owned small businesses set up tables. She thought it might be a good way for me to meet other small business owners who needed bookkeeping help. I almost didn't go. I spent the night before convinced it was a mistake. At 3 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, telling myself I was too old, too rusty, that nobody was going to take seriously a 62-year-old woman who hadn't held a job since the early 90s. Then I thought about Lawrence's voice on the phone, the patience in it, the absolute certainty that I would eventually give up and return to the shape he had made for me. I went to the fair. I set up a small table with a printed sign, Holt Bookkeeping, Small Business Financial Services, and sat behind it feeling thoroughly ridiculous for the first 45 minutes, while people walked past carrying artisan bread and handmade candles. Then a woman stopped. She was around my age, running a small catering company, completely overwhelmed by her receipts. We talked for 20 minutes. She hired me on the spot. Then a younger woman with a new jewelry business asked if I handled GST filings. I said yes. She took my card. Then Patricia came by with coffee and stood next to my table, beaming like a proud older sister. By the end of the day, I had 5 new clients and a full card holder of contacts. Driving home through the spring evening with the car windows down, I started laughing. Not the polite, managed laughter I had practiced for 30 years at dinner parties. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere you forgot you had. 2 weeks after the fair, Lawrence showed up at Patricia's shop. I was in the back office when I heard the door. Patricia came and got me quietly, her expression careful. Lawrence stood near the front display table, still in his overcoat. He looked around the shop with the contained judgment of a man evaluating something he considers beneath him. "There you are," he said, as though I had been lost. Patricia stayed near the front desk. I stood with my arms at my sides. "What are you doing here, Lawrence?" "I came to talk to you." He glanced at Patricia pointedly. "Whatever you need to say, you can say it," I told him. He looked at me for a moment, recalibrating. Then he said, more quietly, "The discovery process is turning up some concerns." "I know," I said. His jaw tightened slightly. "Eleanor Marsh is escalating things unnecessarily as she's doing her job," I said. "Vivian." He said my name the way he always had when he thought I was being unreasonable, like a comma before the correction. "You don't fully understand what you're doing." Patricia made a small sound near the desk. She didn't look up from her computer. I looked at Lawrence steadily. He had aged in the months since I left, or perhaps I was simply seeing him differently now. The confidence that had always seemed like solidity to me now looked like rigidity. A man who had spent so long in control of everything around him that he had no idea how to stand in a room without it. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I said. He lowered his voice. "You had a comfortable life. Security. You're throwing it away for what? Part-time work at a bookshop? Spreadsheets?" "I'm throwing it away for myself," I said. "You should go." He left. Patricia waited until the door closed, then turned around. "Vivian." "I know," I said. "You were extraordinary just now." I laughed shakily. "I was terrified." "I know," she said. "That's what made it extraordinary." That spring, something unexpected began to happen. Several clients referred friends and colleagues. By June, I had more work than I could manage alone 2 mornings a week, and Patricia generously let me use the small back office on a 4th morning. I was not wealthy, but I was paying my rent, covering my groceries, managing my own finances for the first time in 31 years, and going to sleep each night without the low, constant hum of anxiety that had lived in my chest. For so long I had stopped recognizing it as anxiety. I called it peace. It felt enormous. Connor came for dinner one evening in June. I had moved into a slightly larger apartment by then, still modest, still on Merivale Road, but with a 2nd bedroom and a proper dining table. I made roast chicken and my grandmother's apple crisp. Connor ate 2 helpings of everything and then sat back looking at me across the table with an expression I couldn't immediately identify. "You look different," he said. "Different how?" He thought about it. "Like yourself," he said. "Like the person in the old photos. Before." He stopped. "Before your father," I thought. But I didn't say it. Connor rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, Stephanie and I have been talking." He paused. "About some of the things we saw, over the years. Things we didn't name." I waited. "I think I excused a lot of it," he said quietly. "Because he was my dad and I didn't want to." Another stop. "I'm sorry." There were tears in his eyes, which surprised me, because Connor has his father's stoicism. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "You were inside it," I said. "That changes what looks normal." He nodded slowly. Then he looked up. "Stephanie wants to know if she can come next time." "Of course she can," I said. He smiled. It was the first time in years I had seen him smile without something careful behind it. Eleanor called me to her office in October. She laid 3 folders on the desk, with the efficiency of a woman who had spent decades delivering information without drama. The picture was not good for Lawrence. The transferred funds from joint accounts, the undisclosed corporate entity, the property sales, and the signature irregularities had accumulated into something that the opposing counsel could no longer minimize. Lawrence's legal fees were significant. Several business relationships had grown complicated once the discovery process surfaced certain documentation. There were community people who had known both of us for years and were asking questions Lawrence couldn't comfortably answer. Eleanor looked at me over her glasses. "You were right not to confront him early on," she said. "These cases turn on documentation." The settlement, when it came, was fair. I was not going to be wealthy, but I had a foundation. Enough to stop renting and eventually buy a small condo near the river. Enough to invest back into my growing bookkeeping practice. Enough to stop measuring my safety in someone else's willingness to provide it. The morning after the settlement was finalized, I walked along the Rideau River for an hour in the November cold. The path was mostly empty. Geese moved across the gray water. Leaves were down. I stopped at a bench and sat for a while, hands wrapped around a travel mug. I was 63 years old. I had started over. It was still morning. The second year was harder in some ways and easier in others. My practice grew, slowly and steadily. I took on a junior client, who was a young woman fresh out of college starting a graphic design business and had never filed a tax return in her life. I helped her set up a proper system from scratch. At the end of our first meeting, she looked at the clean spreadsheet on her screen and said, "I actually understand my own money now." That sentence stayed with me for days. I started a women's financial literacy workshop, 2 Saturdays a month, in the back room of Patricia's shop, free of charge for women returning to work after long domestic absences. 6 women came to the first ones. By the third workshop, there were 14. Several of them cried at some point during the session. Not from sadness, from the particular relief of discovering that the thing you were told you couldn't understand was actually very manageable when someone explained it without condescension. Lawrence contacted me twice in the year following the settlement. The first time was a brief email, formal, distant, informing me that he was restructuring his business. The second time was a handwritten letter, which arrived on a Tuesday in spring. "Vivian," it began. "I don't expect this to change anything." I sat at my kitchen table with the letter for a long time. The afternoon light was long and flat through the window. He wrote that he had spent 30 years believing that being the provider made him the center of things that mattered. He wrote that he understood now what that cost me. The words were careful, measured, the words of a man who had spent his life writing contracts. But underneath them something was there that I recognized as true. I had spent years afraid that the damage he caused was too great to outlast. What I discovered instead was that it was too great to carry indefinitely. There is a difference. Carrying damage forever keeps you anchored to the person who caused it. Setting it down, not forgetting, not excusing, just releasing its authority over your daily breath, that is what finally let me move forward. I wrote back, a short letter. Not warm, not cold, honest. I told him I had made peace with what happened in the only way I knew how, by building something that belonged to me. I told him that I hoped he found his way to something honest too. I don't know whether he did. I stopped needing to know. The third spring, after my divorce, on a warm April Saturday that smelled like thawed earth and someone nearby cutting grass for. The first time, I stood on the sidewalk outside a small storefront on Wellington Street West in Hintonburg and looked up at the freshly painted sign. Holt Financial Services, Small Business Bookkeeping and Advisory. The lettering was clean dark green on cream. Helen had helped me choose the colors. Patricia had brought champagne. Connor and Stephanie had carried boxes. A woman named Ruth Okafor, who had come to my third financial literacy workshop and was now a qualified bookkeeper herself, was going to be my first part-time associate. I stood on the pavement for a moment longer than I needed to. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted to feel the full weight of standing there. Someone had told me, for 30 years, in many different ways, that I would never survive without him. And I had believed it long enough to let it reshape me into someone smaller and quieter, and more apologetic than I had ever actually been. But I had survived. And then some. If there is one thing I want to leave with you, from all of this, it's something I learned not in a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but on a cold bathroom floor at 62 years old, frightened and uncertain, and more myself than I had been in decades. Your worth was never inside someone else's willingness to confirm it. It was always yours. It simply waited, patient as numbers in a closed ledger, for you to finally come back and count it properly. If this story found you at the right moment, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below and tell me where in Canada you're watching from, or wherever in the world you're joining us tonight. I read every single one.